Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
The Tale of Miss Kitty Cat by Arthur Scott Bailey, 1877 to 1949. Chapter 9. The Stolen Cream. "I can't believe it," Farmer Green's wife exclaimed one day. "Someone's been stealing my cream from the pantry." The pantry was a cool, bare room on the shady side of the house, where large pans of milk rested on a long table. When the cream rose to the top of the milk, Mrs. Green skimmed it off and stored it in cans. At one end of the pantry there was a trapdoor in the floor. When opened, it revealed a well below. Using a rope tied to a beam under the floor, Mrs. Green lowered the cream cans into the cold water, keeping the tops above the surface. Mrs. Green used the cream to make butter, so it was no surprise she was upset when she found one of her milk pans tampered with. "It can't be the cat," she told Farmer Green. "The pantry door has been shut tight the whole time." Miss Kitty Cat was sitting in the kitchen while Mrs. Green explained this to her husband. She seemed to agree wholeheartedly, purring as she rubbed against Mrs. Green. It was as if Miss Kitty was saying, "I'm an honest cat, I wouldn't do such a thing." At least that's what Mrs. Green thought. After that, Mrs. Green often found clues in the pantry. Flecks of cream on the edge of a milk pan, drops on the table, and the occasional smudge on the floor. But she couldn't figure out who the thief was. Then something else strange happened. Miss Kitty Cat lost interest in milk. She would leave her saucer untouched on the kitchen floor. Now and then Mrs. Green picked up Miss Kitty to inspect her face. Each time Miss Kitty purred happily, showing no signs of guilt or concern. One evening, after dark, Johnny Green went into the pantry to grab a pail. As soon as he opened the door, there was a loud crash inside. Startled, Johnny jumped back. "Someone's in the pantry," he shouted. Farmer Green grabbed a light and went to investigate, but when they looked inside, there was no one there, just a tin dipper lying on the floor. "It must have fallen off the edge of the table when you opened the door," Farmer Green said. "Meow," came a voice behind them. There was Miss Kitty, sitting calmly and seeming to agree with Farmer Green's explanation. "She couldn't have been in here, could she?" Farmer Green wondered aloud. He picked her up and held her under the light. "Not a trace of cream on her," he said. "She must have just followed us in." He set her down again, and Miss Kitty gave a soft, innocent meow, as if to say he was absolutely right. Chapter 10. The Creamy Face. Farmer Green's wife threw away pan after pan of milk because she suspected someone was stealing the cream off the top. She told Farmer Green to feed the milk to the pigs, refusing to make butter from cream that had been interfered with by who knows what. Old Spot grumbled that giving good creamy milk to the pigs was just as bad as throwing it away. He shared his frustration with Miss Kitty Cat, adding that it was shameful someone was stealing the cream and promising to catch the culprit. Miss Kitty Cat didn't respond. "Don't you want me to catch the thief?" Spot asked. "Please don't talk to me," Miss Kitty snapped impatiently. "I don't enjoy your chatter. I'd rather not hear it." "Fine," Spot replied, "but when I catch the thief I'll let you know." She's jealous, Spot thought. She knows I'm a great watchdog and hates the idea of me solving this mystery. It was often hard to tell what Miss Kitty was feeling. She was the type to keep her opinions to herself and preferred to be left alone by everyone except Farmer Green's family. After boasting about catching the cream thief, Spot began watching the buttery closely. No matter how hard he searched, he couldn't find any hole big enough for even a mouse to sneak through. One day, he spotted something moving under the roof of the shed next to the buttery. To his surprise, he saw Miss Kitty slip through an old stovepipe hole in the chimney, which led into the buttery. Inside there was an ancient fireplace no one had used for years. Miss Kitty crept along the beam and disappeared into a pile of odds and ends, left to collect dust and cobwebs. "Aha," Spot muttered to himself, "this is getting interesting." Later that day, Miss Kitty strolled into the kitchen looking spotless, no dust or grime anywhere on her fur. Never guessed she'd been crawling through a chimney. Spot didn't say anything to her, but chuckled to himself. He had a plan. That afternoon, when Miss Kitty was nowhere to be seen, Farmer Green's wife went into the buttery to fetch some cream for supper. Spot suddenly started barking in the shed. He scrambled up a stepladder, leaning against the wall, frantically pawing at the air like he was trying to fly. The commotion brought Mrs. Green rushing into the buttery. She arrived just in time to see Miss Kitty piecing it out the stovepipe hole, with a creamy smudge on her face. It was clear she'd been helping herself to the cream and didn't even have time to clean her face. After that, Farmer Green sealed up the stovepipe hole. Soon, Miss Kitty's appetite for milk returned, and when Mrs. Green set out a saucer for her, she lapped it up greedily, even licking the saucer clean. Spot watched her with a smug grin. "I told you I'd let you know when I caught the thief," he teased. Miss Kitty calmly wiped her face before replying, "Don't boast, it's not very classy. Besides, I knew who the thief was long before you did." Chapter 11. The Wren's Home. Every bird on the farm disliked Miss Kitty Cat, and most were afraid of her. However, there was one exception, the wrens. Unlike the other birds, they had a solid reason to feel safe and not worry about her. Miss Kitty frequently grumbled and complained whenever she talked about Rusty Wren and his hard-working wife, who lived in the cherry tree near Farmer Green's window. The wrens shouldn't feel so proud of their so-called house, Miss Kitty would say with a sniff. It's nothing more than an old syrup can. I know for a fact that Mrs. Bluebird considered it last spring when she was looking for a home, but she turned it down immediately. I heard her tell Mr. Bluebird it wasn't fit to live in. But the very reason the Wren family loved their home was the same reason Miss Kitty couldn't stand it. She couldn't get inside. The opening of the syrup can, which served as their front door, was only about the size of a quarter. It was far too small for Miss Kitty, but perfectly sized for Rusty Wren and his plump wife. Miss Kitty tried every argument she could think of to convince the wrens to build a traditional nest in the tree branches like other birds. "I'm sure you'd be much happier in an open nest," she told them. "There's no reason you can't be just as fashionable as everyone else. Well, this cherry tree has plenty of space, room for 100 lovely nests." "We're happy with our house," Rusty Wren replied firmly, "and I wouldn't move even if he wanted to," Mrs. Wren chimed in. Miss Kitty gave a sly smile. "Maybe he'd move just because he doesn't want to." Mrs. Wren shook her head decisively. "No, I'm quite satisfied with our home. And frankly, the other birds will be safer if they built their nests in snug, secure places like we do." Miss Kitty sighed dramatically. "You'll never know what you're missing if you don't try an open nest. Just yesterday, I visited Jolly Robin's family in the orchard. The chicks are absolutely beautiful, but you keep your little ones hidden away in that old syrup can where no one can admire them. It's such a shame. Fine nestlings like yours deserve to be seen by the whole community." Chapter 12. Jolly Robin's News. In a way, Miss Kitty Cat was a patient creature. She could play the waiting game, spending hours watching rat holes without getting restless. After talking with Rusty Wren and his wife, trying to convince them to give up their box-like house and build an open nest like most other birds, Miss Kitty left. "I'll let my words sink in," she muttered to herself. "They will want to discuss it privately." It wasn't often that she was so pleasant to any of the birds. In fact, Rusty Wren began to think she was much kinder than he had thought. "Miss Kitty is very agreeable," Rusty said to his wife. "Did you notice how sweetly she spoke about our children?" "Huh," Mrs. Wren replied. "She may fool you, but not me. She's all charm, but I see right through her." "I don't see how you can say that about Miss Kitty Cat," Rusty said. "She doesn't eat milk." "I suppose next you'll say she doesn't eat birds," his wife retorted. "I think you've been listening to gossip," Rusty said. "If Miss Kitty Cat comes back, I hope you'll be polite to her." Rusty immediately regretted saying that because Mrs. Wren started scolding him. He quickly flew away to find a good excuse. He flew over to the orchard where he met Jolly Robin, who looked very upset. "What's wrong?" Rusty asked. "So much," Jolly Robin replied. "We had a visitor yesterday." "Is that so bad?" Rusty asked. "You'd think so if it were me. It was Miss Kitty Cat, and when she left she took one of our nestlings with her." "Maybe she just borrowed it," Rusty suggested. "Maybe she'll bring it back today." No, Jolly Robin said. If she comes back, it'll only be to take another one. Suddenly Rusty remembered he had told his wife to be polite to Miss Kitty Cat the next time she visited. I have to hurry home, he cried. I need to warn my wife. But your nestings are safe, Jolly Robin assured him. Miss Kitty Cat can't reach inside the tin can you built your nesting. That's true, Rusty said. But what about my wife? Miss Kitty might hurt her if she's not paying attention. With that, he flew home as fast as he could. An unwelcome guest. As Rusty Wren neared his home in the cherry tree, he was met with a frightening sight. Miss Kitty Cat was crouched right on the top of the tin syrup can that Johnny Green had nailed to the tree. Inside that can was the Wren's family nest, and in the nest were some brand new chicks, only 2 days old. It was no wonder that when Rusty Wren returned from the orchard and saw what was happening, he started to shriek. "What are you doing on my roof?" he cried. Miss Kitty Cat looked up calmly and watched him as he hopped about in the tree above her. "I've come to make another visit to your wife," she explained. From inside the can a muffled boy chirped. "She's been here a long time and I can't get her to go away." The moment he heard that, Rusty Wren felt better. It was his wife's voice and it meant she was safe. Rusty knew she was trapped in their house, though, because it was clear she couldn't have leave as long as Miss Kitty Cat was waiting on the roof, ready to pounce the moment Mrs. Wren stepped outside. "Your wife is very shy," Miss Kitty said to Rusty Wren with a sly smile. "I've been hoping to get to know her better. That's why I climbed up and sat on your roof. When people are shy and don't invite me inside, I like to make myself at home outside while I wait for them to appear." From inside the house, Mrs. Wren called out to her husband. "Don't listen to her sweet talk. Remember what I told you, she's a trickster. If you'd seen her trying to reach her paw through the door, you'd know how dangerous she is." "There," Miss Kitty Cat sighed. "People never seem to understand my ways. I was only trying to shake hands." "Shake hands with her claws," Mrs. Wren's voice cried. "Ugh, she's a wicked creature." "Go away," Rusty Wren scolded. "Get off my roof. Get out of my tree." By now, other birds from around the neighbourhood had gathered, calling Miss Kitty Cat names. Some even swooped close to her, as if they planned to peck her eyes out. Miss Kitty started to look a little worried. "Goodness, where have all these birds come from?" she thought. "I had no idea there were so many around here. I guess there's better hunting than I thought." But try as they might, the birds couldn't get Miss Kitty Cat to move from the top of the Wren's house. Rusty was extremely upset. "I don't know what to do," he cried. "My wife will starve in there, and the chicks too." Just then, little Mr. Chippy came rushing up to him. "Don't worry," Mr. Chippy called. "He's coming. He's on his way now, and if anyone can help, it's him." Miss Kitty Cat's ears perked up. She couldn't help but hear Mr. Chippy's words. "I'll stay right here," she said firmly. "Nobody can make me move." Just then a surprising sound made her jump. It was a loud meow. Chapter 14, Cat Calls. Perched on top of Rusty Wren's tin house, Miss Kitty Cat was enjoying herself while the birds made a loud fuss, trying in vain to scare her off. When she suddenly heard an unexpected meow, it startled her. "A cat!" Miss Kitty exclaimed. "I didn't think there was another cat for miles around." She looked all around, both on the ground and in the treetops, but couldn't spot a cat anywhere. Meanwhile, the birds were all chirping excitedly. "There, he's here. Miss Kitty Cat had better watch out." Again, a strange mocking meow came from somewhere. There was a teasing tone to it that made Miss Kitty Cat angry. "He's come, has he?" she said to little Mr. Chippy, who was chattering from a safe distance. "If he's looking for a fight, I'd be happy to give him one." Whoever the stranger was, and wherever he was, he knew how to tease Miss Kitty Cat. First he howled at her from the lilac bushes on the edge of the flower garden. Then he mewed at her from the hedge in front of the farmhouse. Miss Kitty Cat tried to catch a glimpse of him, but she couldn't see anything that even looked like a cat. The annoying cries seemed to move from one place to another, but the source of them stayed hidden. "This is strange," Miss Kitty Cat thought. "Can there be a cat's voice around here, but no cat to go with it? A cat without a voice would be odd enough, but a voice with no cat, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard." Finally, Rusty Wren seemed to gain some courage, and his wife, from inside their house, scolded Miss Kitty Cat loudly, at least as loudly as she could from inside the tin syrup can. "I always knew you were a coward," she said to Miss Kitty. "You're always ready to attack us little birds, but you don't dare fight anyone your own size." "How can I fight someone I can't see?" Miss Kitty asked. "If this noisy stranger would come out in the open, I'd show him whether I'd fight him or not. I'd teach him, and if I could catch him, not to interfere when I'm making a neighbourly visit." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wren called back. "You don't mean half of what you say. If you weren't a fake, you'd go and find this person who's mocking you." Meow, ow, ow. The mocking call rang out again, making Miss Kitty Cat's ears twitch. "There," Mrs. Wren said. "There it is again. That would make me furious if somebody spoke to me like that. But I guess it doesn't bother you. You're probably used to people yelling at you." That was more than Miss Kitty Cat could take. She scrambled down the old cherry tree and ran across the yard to the currant bushes where the last cat calls had come from. As she got closer, a slim, slate-coloured bird gave a sharp laugh as he flew out of the bushes. It was Mr. Catbird. Miss Kitty Cat felt foolish when she saw him. She realised he had been the one fooling her with his mocking cries. The birds, including Mr. Catbird and Mrs. Wren, gathered around Miss Kitty and made such a racket that she crept away and hid in the hayloft. She couldn't stand much noise unless she was the one making it, especially at night by the light of the moon. Chapter 15, Mousetraps. "I don't understand," said old dog Spot to Miss Kitty Cat one day, "why Mrs. Green wants to keep you around the house when she can just buy mousetraps at the village." Old Spot eyed Miss Kitty slyly. He loved to watch her whiskers bristle and her tail puff up. He could make both of those things happen almost any time he wanted. If anyone wanted to see Miss Kitty Cat get upset, all they had to do was mention mousetraps. Of all the useless things, she thought, they were the worst. "They only catch the dumbest mice," she used to say. "A mouse with any sense won't go near a trap unless he's starving. If he's willing to do a little work for a piece of stale cheese, he can usually set the trap off without getting caught, even if he has to use his tail to do it." "But a mouse trap," Spot argued, "takes little care. You only have to set it up when you want to catch a mouse, and everyone knows Mrs. Green feeds you several times a day. Besides, the fewer mice you catch, the more food she wastes on you." "Rubbish," Miss Kitty Cat sniffed. "You eat 10 times as much as I do. I've never heard of you catching a mouse." "Ah," said Spot, "don't forget I drive the cows, guard the house and keep watch over the barns at night. And in my spare time I hunt woodchucks. You couldn't expect someone as important as me to waste time catching mice. Mousetraps couldn't do my work," Old Spot continued. "There's never been a mousetrap made that could drive a cow." "That's one of the reasons I don't like them," Miss Kitty Cat replied. "They're not only bad at catching mice, but they're useless for anything else. Whenever I catch a mouse, I always make it as pleasant as possible for him. I play with him for as long as I can, but a trap just goes snap. It doesn't try to make friends with anyone." Old Spot laughed right in Miss Kitty Cat's face. "You really care about your friends, the mice," he chuckled, "and I'm sure they care a lot about you too. If you knew what they call you, you'd be pretty angry." "What's that?" Miss Kitty demanded. "I don't want to tell you," Spot said. "I don't want to hurt your feelings." He knew, the trickster, that he could please Miss Kitty more by leaving her to wonder what name the mice had for her. Although Miss Kitty was dying to know, she was too proud to ask again. With a huff, she suddenly jumped up and walked away stiffly. "I'll have to find a mouse somewhere," she muttered under her breath. "I'll have to find a mouse and make him tell me what Old Spot won't." Chapter 16, A Midnight Meal. Down in the farmhouse cellar, a plump couple known as Mr. and Mrs. Moses Mouse emerged from a hole beneath the pantry floor. They scurried down a post to the cellar floor. "This is getting ridiculous," Mr. Mouse grumbled. "Mrs. Green barely left us a crumb in the pantry to begin with, and ever since Miss Snooper showed up, there's nothing left at all." Mrs. Mouse nodded, looking rather gloomy. "Do you remember, Moses," she said to her husband, "those lovely bits of stale cheese Mrs. Green used to leave down here?" Sure, they were stuck on a bit of wire, and you had to watch out for that loop snapping shut, but you always avoided it so skillfully. Oh yes, those were the good days, or nights, I suppose, Mr. Mouse said with a wistful sigh. Just thinking about that fine old mouldy cheese makes me sad. I bet Mrs. Green gives it to that awful Miss Snooper now. Mrs. Mouse said as she climbed onto the shelf to inspect the labels on rows of jam and jelly jars. Moses watched her hopefully. Being on the heavier side, he wasn't eager to climb up there himself. Are there any of them open? He asked. No, his wife replied. Is there at least a bit of sweetness dripping down the sides? He pressed. No, not a drop. I'm sure Miss Snooper has licked them all clean. That miserable Miss Snooper has ruined everything, Moses Mouse declared. For such a plump fellow, he looked oddly pitiful. I don't know how we're going to get supper, he whined, as he always did when he was hungry. There's still that lump of pussy Farmer Green left in the woodshed, his wife said. Ugh, Moses pulled a face. We've eaten that for the last 3 nights, and I hated it every time. His eyes scanned the cellar until they landed on the dark corner. What's in the box over there? He asked. I have no idea, Mrs. Mouse replied. Well, go check, he snapped. I'm so faint I can hardly stand. Mrs. Mouse, knowing her husband was always grumpy when hungry, humoured him. She scampered across the cellar floor and disappeared into the box. When Moses didn't hear anything for a while, he grew even more impatient. Well, he called, what did you find? Potatoes, came his wife's muffled reply, her mouth clearly full. Oh dear, I forgot to call you over.